Hello, everyone. In this brief addendum to our interactive class this past week, wherein we discussed the color out of space and wrapped up our conversations on that story, I just wanted to mention a few things about the interpretation of the color as a kind of Satan analog, and also the overriding theme of this work, or one of the overriding themes of this work, that ultimately it's impossible for people to conceal the past despite their desperate attempts to do so. We can't run from the past, we can't change it, we can't conceal it. And the very effort to do so ultimately results in our destruction. So I'm going to unpack both of these concepts very briefly. With respect to the color out of space as a kind of Satan parallel, we already noted that based on the allusions that we discussed last class to St. Elmo's fire and the tongues of fire that descended on the apostles' heads at Pentecost, that the color out of space itself has this bizarre association with divinity or the supernatural. And we suggested that it's a result of the fact that Lovecraft is suggesting that the very center of all existence, the thing that supposedly grants us meaning, God, this being beyond ourselves, that is subsistent existence itself, that is being itself, that gives us our purpose in the universe, establishes it, is in fact the color out of space, right? Now, the color of space isn't really God. It's the representation of the universe itself that is blind, purposeless, chaotic. It's the antithesis of God. And so by framing it in the terms of God, Lovecraft is evacuating the very idea of God, of any of its meaning, of any of its value and its purpose. And he's saying that ultimately, the thing that shows us our meaning and gives us our meaning is, well, the universe, and it's purposeless. It gives us no meaning at all. So it's a kind of farce or a farcical representation of divinity or association with divinity, because he's denying teleology. He's defying and denying any kind of purpose to existence. That's embodied in the color of space, and it's highlighted by the fact that it's described in terms that connect it to the Judeo-Christian God. Now, with respect to it's the color of space as a Satan analog or Satan parallel. In the story, there are innumerable references to the color out of space being a kind of demon hatchling. So much of the language that's used to describe the color of space frames it in terms of the demonic or the infernal. The color out of space also descends from the heavens, like Satan himself. So Satan, in the description of the fall of Satan, as embodied by Lucifer, is described as having been cast out of heaven. So we discussed that reference to Milton. In John Milton's Paradise Lost, Satan is cast out of heaven. So Milton's Paradise Lost, like we said, is this retelling or reimagining with extensive detail of the narrative of Satan, the narrative of Lucifer, in the Christian Bible or in the Christian scriptures. All you get in the Christian scriptures is this oblique reference to the dragon and to Lucifer being cast out of heaven, being thrown down like this from the stars. But in Paradise Lost, this epic poem, this extensive poem by Milton, the fall of Satan is actually presented in a far more extended fashion. Satan is cast out of heaven. He falls to the earth, or he falls from heaven and burrows all the way down to basically the center of the earth, to hell itself. He then rises in order to corrupt mankind, to destroy mankind in the Garden of Eden. Now, there's a great deal more material and information and specific examples that we can explore there, but the color operates in a very similar fashion. He falls from the stars, or it falls from the stars. It burrows into the ground. It corrupts everything. It corrupts the gardeners, just as Satan corrupts the Garden of Eden. It gets into the fruit, and the fruit is tainted, right? And it brings with it knowledge. So just as in the Garden of Eden, you have the corrupt, well, the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which the individuals there, Adam and Eve, consume, so too do you have this strange fruit, as the color of space is described at the end of the story. This was no fruit from the stars. So right before the end, about the fifth to last paragraph, Lovecraft says, "This was no fruit of such worlds and suns as shines on the telescopes and photographic plates of our observatories." The Gardner family have actually consumed the color out of space because it has infected the various different, well, actual literal fruits and contaminated the water on the Gardner farm. This pervasive contamination and the stripping away of their humanity, the deterioration of their nature, and the replacement, as we said in that interactive class, of the color out of space nature, or the placement of that nature onto the gardeners, because they start to speak in irrational terms, in terms that reflect a kind of madness, indicative of the realms from whence the color out of space, this fruit from the skies, has come. So the way in which the color stamps its image, its insanity, its madness, its chaos, right, that isn't any of those things, it just looks like that to us, because we don't understand how anything works out there in the true universe, as it stamps that image onto the gardeners and perverts them and taints them and corrupts them. It's doing exactly what Satan did in the Garden of Eden. Satan comes along and he stamps the image of rebellion on Adam and Eve. He corrupts their nature as being reflections of God. They are made in the image of God, and now that image is tainted, corrupt, and violated and broken. The Color of Space does the same thing. So there are a number of different parallels that we can draw between the color as a kind of Satan analog and the ambiguity regarding the blasted heath and its referent, whether it's referring back to Shakespeare or referring to Milton. The other thing I wanted to discuss was the attempt to cover over the past and the inability to do so. Ultimately, this story is a revelation of the absolute impossibility of concealing the truth and concealing the truth of the past and our desperate desire to do so. All these characters are fixated on denying, on cutting away, on trimming away the signs of madness and the signs of the color's influence. I've drawn out here a series of quotations from the text that illustrate, both directly and indirectly by way of oblique symbolism and characters' actions in parallel or in analog to this major theme, the way in which the story articulates the idea that ultimately the attempt to cover over the past or to deny the past and the reality of that past is futile. In a way, it's an attempt to conceal or a desire to conceal the reality of our origins. Remember that Lovecraft is stridently atheistic. As a result, he, of course, rejects any of the kind of creation narratives or teleological purposes that are given to us by way of those creation narratives, such as the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. So what he might be saying here is that human beings have this desperate desire to deny the reality of our own origins and of our own past. Part of that past is, well, for Lovecraft, the fact that we are nothing but cosmic accidents, a random series of evolutionary mistakes and chemical processes that have eventually resulted in us, creatures that have this illusion of free will when in reality everything is mechanistic, everything is deterministic. We don't make choices, our brains are just fizzing chemicals and the collision of atoms, and what we think are our thoughts and our independent choices of will are nothing of the sort. So we have this desperate desire to deny the reality of our origins, our past, as nothing more than that. However, the attempt to do so is futile and destructive. And so we're going to run through a few different quotations and interpret them in light of that overarching theme or belief that Lovecraft articulates through the story. At the outset of the story, we have a description of setting. There was once a road over hills and through the valleys that ran straight where the blasted heath is now, but people ceased to use it, and a new road was laid curving far towards the south. So there's this desperate desire to avoid, to eschew that area wherein the color has left its influence, it's left its stamp of chaos. So there's this impulse to escape it. But the attempt to deny its existence, to cut it off from sight and to compartmentalize it, to pretend that it's not there, is ultimately impossible. Because, well, traces of it still remain. Traces of the old one can still be found amidst the weeds of returning wilderness. And some of them will doubtless linger even when half of the hollows are flooded for the new reservoir. So they're flooding it over with the new reservoir, but even that can't conceal the remnants of our past. And even worse, those remnants are spreading. The dark woods will be cut down, and the blasted heath will slumber far below the blue waters whose surface will mirror the sky and ripple in the sun. And the secrets of the strange days will become one with the deep secrets, one with the hidden lore of old ocean, and all the mystery of primal earth. Now, the reality is that no matter what we do, we can't escape the past, we can't escape the influence of the color, we can't escape the reality of cosmic indifference that it represents. Whatever demon hatchling is there, it must be tethered to something, or else it would quickly spread. Is it fastened to the roots of those trees that claw at the air? One of the current Arkham tales is about fat oaks that shine and move as they ought not do at night. So that past is still there, the color is still there, the influence is undeniable. The reservoir will soon be built now, and all those elder secrets will be safe forever under watery fathoms. Now he attempts to assert that, but the story itself indicates that that's obviously not the case. The narrator wants to believe that he can deny the existence of the color and that somehow the creation of this reservoir will protect them all. But it won't. The color out of space lived in the well. It infected the water, and through the water, the gardeners. How much wider is its influence going to spread now that so foolishly, in attempting to conceal it and attempting to cover it over, mankind has just given it more room, more territory in which to fester and grow and influence others? Nothing, he says, could bribe me to drink the new city water of Arkham. This reservoir is being created to provide water for the city. And subconsciously, the narrator recognizes, oh yes, that's not going to fix the problem at all. It's only going to make it much, much worse, right? It's not going to cover over things. But he doesn't say that outright. He wants to believe that those elder secrets will be safe forever under watery fathoms. So it's a kind of cognitive dissonance. The reality is that the influence of the color, just like the influence of the past that it kind of represents and the chaos that it represents, can't be denied and it can't be constrained. In fact, there are no limits. The color out of space breaks down boundary lines, breaks down the definitions of language and thought, concepts, conceptions, and also connotations. Here, it's doing the same thing. There are no boundaries that we can set up, no limitations, no systems that can hold it, that can restrain it. It's constantly bursting forth like an overripe fruit. As the narrator says, the rural tales are queer. They might be even queerer if city men and college chemists could be interested enough to analyze the water from the disused well, or the gray dust that no wind seems ever to disperse. Botanists, too, ought to study the stunted flora that borders that spot of the blasted heath, for they might shed light on the country notion that the blight is spreading, little by little, perhaps an inch each year. And snow never seems to lay quite so heavily on the blasted heath as it does elsewhere. The Lovecraft is saying here, as he does elsewhere when he states that the color out of space has gone beyond the boundaries of the old road. It's spreading, yes, but there's no boundary, there's no borderline that can prevent it from doing so. And little by little, even as we try to ignore it, it's taking up a little bit more space. It's consuming a little bit more. And even nature, as it desperately attempts to destroy the color out of space, it tries to expel it like a contagion through the lightning storm that strikes the meteor and destroys it but can't remove the color itself, and through the snow that peppers over the area and yet can't conceal it. It doesn't fall quite so heavily. There's always that mar, almost like the radiation burns of the creature still remain and melt just a little bit of that snow. Nothing can paper it over, not nature, not man, not the boundary lines that we levy, not even the secrets of old earth as contained in the great swirling maelstrom of waters that will cover it over when the new dam is created. So, in the same way, we have physical representations of this attempt. Nahum Gardner tries to lock his wife away. He tries to lock that madness away in the attic and to deny its existence, but it fails. Nothing generative comes out of it. In fact, it only exacerbates the problem. The denial of the issue only causes the issue to grow worse. So those would be the two major issues that tie up our conversation on the color out of space. Just completing the conversation we weren't able to, to finalize in that interactive class on Thursday morning. All right. Keep these things in mind as we go into the discussion of our color out of space film adaptations, because we'll be exploring these themes in a little bit more depth based on how the authors or the filmmakers and directors of these works actually engage with the topic.